You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're chatting with Professor Des Fitzgerald about his new book, The Living City, Why Cities Don't Need to Be Green to Be Great. We chat about what trees mean to people, the proliferation of city-building moguls, and the idea of what makes the good city. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. The weather is changing as we head towards winter, and you know what that means. It's gonna get cold. And scarf weather is here. We've got red bus scarves and green bike scarves, so pick one up to keep you warm on your journey to work or to advocate at a public meeting. These soccer-style scarves can be held up above your head to share your love of bus and bike lanes, and I hope you pick one up for the fall. To get one for you or for a friend, go to theoverheadwire.com and order one today. 5% discount if you order 5 or more. Just send me an email, theoverheadwire@gmail.com, and we can get that set up for you. Otherwise, go to theoverheadwire.com. Well, Des Fitzgerald, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks, Jeff.
Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a sociologist. I do a lot of work around kind of histories of urban mental health. It's my big kick at the moment. I live in a city called Cork in Ireland, which I suspect lots of people won't know. It's a kind of a regional city at the south of, right at the bottom of the island. It's about 300,000 people. I got 2 kids. They're 1 and 3. I don't sleep very much, which is partly why I have this kind of, I can see myself in the Zoom. I got bags under my eyes. It's because my 1-year-old was up at 4 this morning.
I totally understand. I just sent my 1-year-old out the door, so
Excellent.
We're in the same spot.
Out the door is the best place for 1-year-olds, yeah. So I teach sociology at University College Cork. I've been in the UK for about 10 years up to now. I moved back to Ireland recently, and that's an interesting transition in a lot of ways. It's an interesting urban transition that we can talk about a bit. But I teach sociology of cities, sociologies of mental health, and kind of general kind of thing.
Well, I want to know, what's your introduction to cities and, your interest in them? Like, where did that come from? Was it something that happened when you were a small child, or is it something that happened later on in life?
No, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, my real interest is, and still is, and I think it's in this book too, is actually in mental health. I'm interested in how we think about mental health culturally and how that changes over time. And so something I got really interested in a few years ago was this kind of idea that's been around since like mid-19th century, early 19th century maybe, which is that there's some serious relationship between urban space and mental health, that there's something about cities that for some people, some of the time produces madness. And that's been a kind of a phenomenon we've known really since the late 19th century, really since the formalization of the psychiatric profession. It's kind of in some ways the foundational finding of psychiatry, really. When they first started, when asylums become relatively professionalized, when they first start to do demographic studies on people in asylums, it's kind of the first thing they see is this preponderance of people in asylums who were born in or have spent most of their life in urban spaces. So that's just been a huge debate over the years since. So I've been thinking about that for a bunch of years, kind of historically and sociologically, about what that tells us about our cultural ideas about the city. But in the middle of kind of doing that work, well, I'll tell you where I come in with this. So a few years ago, you may or may not know this, in the middle of me doing this work, London declared itself a national park city. I don't know if you know this. So this is a big kind of splashy attempt, I guess, really just to promote green space and kind of, wildlife and various kinds of nice things in London. And of course, calling a city a national park city is deliberately a provocation, right? It puts 2 things together that don't normally go together. So I was just kind of vaguely following this. And I was online one day and I saw an architecture firm who were partnering with the people organizing this, had made this animation. And I don't know if you know London, Jeff. It was an animation of it's Fleet Street, looking east up Fleet Street. So it's right in the center of this historical city of London, looking up towards St. Paul's Cathedral and the Leadenhall building, the one that looks like a cheese grater. So it's a very kind of old, urban, sedimented space, a really kind of classic London view. And in the animation, like vines suddenly start coming down the buildings, like grass sprouts up out of the streets and like trees sprout up everywhere. And, I looked at this and I thought, this looks like the apocalypse to me. And so this idea that like this apocalyptic vision was like aspirational all of a sudden was like a big wow moment for me. I was like, where have we got to in thinking about cities that like this kind of vision from like The Last of Us suddenly feels like, a good future for urban space. So I was kind of thinking about that a lot. And then it occurred to me that the kind of historical stuff I was thinking about in the 19th century, that interesting kind of mental illness, that idea that there's something about urban life that is just not good in some sort of way, that is related to these contemporary ideas about the city as a space that is just not good for us.
It's interesting because it gives me more context about the book, which is great. But also, one of the things that came to mind when I first started reading this was the biblical stories of Adam and Eve and Sodom and Gomorrah and those types of things where, for a long time, cities have been vilified by the powers that be. And it's interesting from that perspective. I just think that, the general anxiety among humans that perhaps we're getting away from our natural roots comes out so long ago, and it continues until this day. And I find that fascinating as somebody who grew up in a suburb, a leafy green suburb called the Livable Forest, and now lives in the city of San Francisco in the center. And so it's an interesting kind of move, that continues throughout history. And I find that really fascinating, especially now that we know things like a meteor actually hit Sodom and Gomorrah and destroyed it, right? They've just like found that out.
Who sent the meteor, Jeff? Clearly some kind of angry deity. I mean, it's true. I mean, I think the city has long stood in for a certain kind of collective anxiety about modernity, right? So I think when people get anxious about the world in moments of transformation, and you see this, I talk about this a little bit in the book, you see this in kind of the early modern world in England around anxieties about deforestation. You see it in the 19th century as people start to move in great waves from the countryside to urban spaces. When there are these kind of collective cultural anxieties about the transformations of modernity with which are now reasonably familiar, the city often comes to stand in for the thing that is wrong, or the figure of badness, or the kind of central symbol of like, I guess, like moral degeneration, often, to use kind of quite 19th century language. I mean, that historical story is well known. I think the thing that's kind of interesting to me about how it appears in the present day is that, I'm a university academic. I move in kind of very, middle class, bourgeois, liberal kind of circles. And it's striking to me that it is, today relatively taken for granted progressive liberal opinion that cities are bad, right? That there's something, that kind of romantic, I would say, even kind of reactionary idea that the city is an unnatural space.
I mean, that's an interesting thought. And that's something that I thought about too, is there are some sides I feel like that feel that way, but other sides that don't. I feel like, at least in my circle that I operate in, which is a very urban planning centric, obviously transportation centric circle, the city is good from a standpoint of, if the denser you are, the more emissions you're reducing, the more people you're connected to, the possibility of reducing or loneliness is greater, those types of things. And so I do see that, though, on, I guess maybe the far left or maybe closer to the progressive set, that there is a feeling that the city needs to be fixed in a way because it's not green enough, or because it's not, as you say many times in the book, because it doesn't go far enough in becoming natural to a certain extent.
I think what's really distinctive about the contemporary discourse, or at least the discourse we've had since sort of the 1980s, I would say, is that the city has done something to us on a species level, right? That as a species that has evolved in a very particular sort of way, the city just does not have the affordances we need, right? And this is the kind of Edward O. Wilson kind of discourse about humankind's evolution on the savannah. And so Wilson has this whole idea that, we need to live on high spaces where we can see predators down below. We want to live near water. We want to live near living things, all those sorts of things. That kind of strange evolutionary story about the city as something that is just like species inappropriate, I think is quite distinctive in how we think about urban space today. And I think it's that kind of, I would say, quasi-scientific story that has trafficked this quite traditional anti-urban feeling into more kind of, what might call liberal technocratic spaces, or it's made it more kind of thinkable in those kind of spaces. It's no longer the case that you hate modernity because you're, just a kind of reactionary who doesn't like, the modern world. It's you have an anxiety about people's health, and you have an anxiety about our health as a species and what is good for us as a population. And therefore, what was a kind of antediluvian, kind of reactionary idea becomes a technocratic scientific one.
One of the funny things that I found in the book is it's very fourth wall to a certain extent. Like there's a lot of like where you talk to us personally in the book. And I really like that. But I also appreciate, you being honest about your friends kind of wondering why you're writing a book about how trees are bad.
Yeah.
And some of your skepticism as well. And I'm curious about your skepticism, I guess, and kind of where that comes from. And some of the ideas that you can see from going and talking to all these people that actually work, but you're still not quite convinced.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm trying to avoid some kind of like therapeutic response to this. Well, I'll give you the kind of therapeutic response. I mentioned in the book, and this is kind of true. Like I say in the book at one point, as someone who's kind of grown up in significant proximity to like literally a bog, I don't have any kind of romantic pastoralist ideas about like the countryside. And that's a little bit true. I mean, I spent the first 7 years of my life in the Midlands of Ireland, which is a distinctly not urban, not glamorous space. It really is a bog, right? I mean, people still are digging turf out of the ground and using it to heat their homes there. And then we moved to Cork and as a teenager, which is a slightly bigger space, but it's still, it's not Manhattan. It's very provincial. So maybe the therapeutic thing here, Jeff, is about growing up on an island. It's that kind of when I was in my early 20s, my now wife and I, we moved to London. I have a very vivid memory, which is like so vivid that it is definitely not true. But nonetheless, I have this very vivid memory of when we moved to London. And sometimes if you get lucky when you fly into London, if you're flying to City Airport, which is right in the center of the city, sometimes the plane kind of does a circle, it comes in from the east. So you get a really low down view of the city. And London, of course, is a huge city, an extremely spread out city, right? So it has this kind of quality of just kind of buildings going on as far as the eye can see. And I have this very vivid memory of us flying in and getting that view and just feeling like extremely soothed and relaxed. And really having that kind of sense of like, oh, this is where I should be. This is like the place for me. It's where I was, I obviously was born in the wrong place. This is where I should have been. And so I've always had that sense of like I genuinely have always found big cities relaxing and rural spaces, if not like frightening, at least kind of anxiety producing. Like my parents live in the countryside. They live in the middle of nowhere, and out their kitchen window, you can see a mountain. And they find this beautiful. This to them is a real bonus of their house. They can see a mountain at the kitchen window. And to me, genuinely, like that mountain is a symbol of something kind of frightening and horrifying. There is just something about that, like, I don't know, it has this kind of post-human quality to it. Right? I mean, it's back to that kind of apocalyptic sensibility again. So I guess the answer to your question, Jeff, is I've always been genuinely baffled by the idea that people find rural spaces soothing. That is just genuinely just not an affect I'm capable of. And so like the book is partly trying to make sense of like, what is it that other people see in this that I'm not seeing?
So then what did you learn about, other people's feelings about nature in cities and, for example, trees? Let's go there because you have a whole chapter in which I actually connected to quite closely. But I'm curious what you learned about trees generally. I mean, it's such a big topic, obviously, but it's something personal to me, I guess. So I'm curious what you came about after, doing the research and coming up with the chapter in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I guess the reason I fixated on, I'm not against trees. I do feel the need to say that. But no, it's not you. I do get this from friends a lot. And as I say, it's in the book and it's kind of a joke, but it's also not a joke, right? Like, so there was a big drama last week in England, which probably didn't make it to North America, but there's a famous tree in England called the Sycamore Gap tree. I don't know if this
Yeah, I saw it. Yeah.
So it's this very old, very picturesque tree in a kind of a scenic hollow on Hadrian's Wall, which is kind of a popular hiking route. And there was a tree that was also in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. And last week, the country woke up and someone had chopped down the tree overnight. Right? And there was these kind of like traumatizing images of the stump, because now there's a gap with just a stump in it. And like people lost their minds, right? And it was like people lost their minds to the extent that like it's very obvious that whatever is going on in people's feelings about what happened, it's not about the tree, right? This single tree is not doing anything environmentally, right? It's not doing anything for anyone's kind of sense of peace and relaxation. It's clearly symbolizing something. And it's that sense of deep attachment that people have to not just individual trees, but the tree as a certain kind of symbol of all that is good and right and proper in the world. That to me is like surprising and alarming. And genuinely, like when that tree got cut down, I had like 5 texts from different people kind of making the same joke. It's like, oh, lucky you moved to Ireland, or I think this was you, So like it's interesting that it's interesting that it's how transgressive it is to say I don't like trees, right? That is genuinely quite a transgressive thing to say now, and even the fact that it's transgressive, I think, is worth thinking with. I mean, I genuinely don't like trees. I have allergies. Like the idea that everyone wants to be in a forest, is I just think it's baffling. And I have a kind of a pet theory, which is that like what feels like my odd, idiosyncratic position about trees is not odd or idiosyncratic. That lots of people feel like this, but actually it's kind of culturally impossible now to say I don't like trees. Actually I prefer if they cut down the trees on my street. Or that is just kind of impossible to express. I mean, sorry, that's not an answer to your question yet, but that's kind of partly where I came in with that.
Which happened in Sheffield, right? Like that's kind of what happened.
That is what
happened. There's some people that were like, I want some of these trees gone.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Sheffield story is super interesting. So, and as you know, a bunch of years ago now, Sheffield City Council basically hired a private company to not to cut down its trees, actually, but actually to manage the roads. So it was actually a road management program that the city council wanted to do. And in the course of managing the roads, of course, the private company that was hired to do this wanted to cut down a bunch of trees, which is not atypical in kind of road management or road widening procedures. And then that kind of snowballed and escalated to the point where the company was cutting down many thousands of trees. And it became this huge public scandal. There was massive protests by local people trying to protect trees. And, it sounds kind of like, I don't know, maybe it sounds kind of ruritarian or kind of cutesy to people, but like it was not any of those things. It was violent and unpleasant. The police were involved, big private security companies were involved. It all got super nasty, super fast, and then kind of just resolved itself in this very unsatisfying way that the council eventually, because things escalated so badly, the council basically paused the tree cutting program. And then many years later, as is often the case, kind of admitted that wasn't so great. And now it's not happening. And now there's a whole different partnership and things are, looking a bit better. But exactly, as you said, I mean, the reason I went to Sheffield was exactly to kind of meet people. Like, it was so baffling to me that you would put so much on the line to protect trees, right? That people were really putting like their livelihoods, their reputation, their criminal records, frankly, online to protect trees in urban space. That to me was so unimaginable to me for myself that like I wanted to kind of meet people who were willing to do that. And as I guess it hopefully comes across in the book that like I am sympathetic to this, right? Like I'm sympathetic to these people. Like I know it sounds like I'm kind of skeptical about this endeavor, but I don't want at all to come across as like dismissive of people for whom this is a really serious major issue. And I think I get it. I think I get why it matters for them. But why it matters for them, I think, really doesn't have all that much to do with trees as kind of biological or botanical objects. I think it has to do with trees as things that stand in for what we want a good city to be. Like, I don't think what alarmed people about that tree cutting program was the trees itself. I think what alarmed them was that sense of like practices and the objects and the kind of ways of going about things that we think constitute good urban life. Whatever those things are, they're on the other side of this program. And so the program comes to stand in for all those kind of wider anxieties about, local democracy, about participation, about people's capacity to access good housing, actually, because the trees associate with nice housing, and all those sorts of ancillary things going on in the background.
I also found it interesting that there was a discussion about the folks who didn't want the trees taken down, but also the folks that were hiding in their houses, worried about the repercussions from their neighbors who wanted the trees taken down.
Yeah.
It was kind of like a confrontation. It feels very, in our discussions today here in California and across the United States, we talk a lot about housing and NIMBYism, right? And it feels very like the two sides of that clashing a somewhat similar way. And the idea of control, local control over your space, control over this and that and the other thing. And some people like the trees for the reasons why they like the trees. And some people don't like the trees because they want to have control over their garden, or they want to have control over a space that they feel is theirs. And I felt that kind of headbutting on that really interesting.
I think that is really interesting. And I think that was one of the things that sort of took the activists by surprise, that actually what seemed to them like a completely unreasonable, over the top approach to the trees was actually like welcomed by significant amounts of people. And exactly for the reasons you say, like people who just don't want leaves falling in their front garden that they have to clean up, or don't want in particular birds pooing on their car. That was a real thing for a lot of people. But I think we should take those seriously as clashes that are about the good city, right? I think we should take that seriously as clashes not about trees, or not about, obviously it's ridiculous to not want leaves to fall in your garden, right? You live on planet Earth. But I think we should take it seriously as two very different visions of what good urban life looks like. And I think I think control is a really right way to think about it, actually. I mean, I think people's sense of how much control they have over the space around them is really important. Like trees obviously stand in for lots of people for a certain sense of kind of calm and timelessness and all those soothing qualities. But also, it seems quite plausible to me that for other people, trees stand in for unruliness, for like lack of control. And I think one of the things I talk about in the book is the relationship between urban tree management and the scientific management of cities more generally. And the coincidence, not the temporal coincidence of the idea that we can govern the city rationally with the emergence of urban tree science as a distinctive set of practices. And that kind of sense that like you govern the trees, you govern the city. I do think that's part of what's going on in those clashes between neighbors in Sheffield, right? That kind of sense that who is going to get to say whether or not leaves fall on this patch of ground? That becomes like a really important political question that is worth taking seriously.
It's a really interesting scientific question, too, because of all of the data science and artificial intelligence and stuff that's going on right now. Like you mentioned, I mean, the idea behind measuring the amount of CO2 a tree can take out of the atmosphere is very, like you say in the book, it's very soothing to council presidents and stuff who want to be able to measure things. And we talk a lot on the show recently about ecosystem services, which you mentioned in the book, but it's very quantifiable in a way, and in a way that otherwise isn't. You know, we had Paula DePerna on recently talking about her book, Pricing the Priceless, right? Figuring out carbon trading. And, you know, the whole idea is that how do you put a price on something so you can operate in this capitalist system that we run in at the moment?
Sure. I mean, I feel like I'm dismissive of a lot of things in the book. I'm actually doing proofs for like the British edition at the moment. And I kind of going through the proofs going like, really, I should be nice about someone at some point. So I am kind of rude about ecosystem services, but actually I'm more sympathetic to it.
First off, I want to say I didn't feel offended.
Offended.
I feel like you're questioning for good reason. So I want to make sure that you hear that.
No, don't worry. Yeah, but that's good. I mean, for example, I have a colleague who works on the relationship between tree canopy cover in cities and the cost of mental health prescriptions and treatment down the line. So his whole thing is that you can not just quantify vegetation in urban space, but actually you can quantify the exact savings in visits to clinicians, in therapy, in lost days to work, all those sorts of things for each square meter of tree cover in a city. I like one that's like super sophisticated, I think. So I don't like in terms of like how you actually get your hands on that data, how you use it. I mean, it's not something I could do. So I don't want to be dismissive of it at all. And I absolutely get why you need to use this language to speak to policymakers, to speak to kind of community groups, you know, to kind of like, I get the rhetoric of it. You know, it makes total sense to me. It's still completely deathly, I think. It's, you know, and I think we should allow ourselves to think that. This is like, you know, I say this as someone who actually doesn't particularly like vegetation, but like to me, the quantification of vegetation is much more violent than anything I could think of, right? That kind of sense that like, you know, trees are an asset that we need to cash out. You know, to me, that's quite dreadful. And I say that as someone who doesn't particularly like trees. And it's baffling to me that lots of people's affection for trees or like desire to have trees in cities is trafficked through that very kind of calculated, quantified discourse. I feel like it's the ecosystem services people who don't like trees, right? I mean, that's genuinely, like in some ways, my horror of the tree, I think, has more authenticity to it than like the kind of bureaucratic attempt to quantify and manage the tree, right? I think on a genuine, I think like my dislike has more respect for it than like the kind of economist attempt to like cash it out.
It's interesting. I mean, I can imagine some economists being that way. And my personal feeling about it is that we're losing a lot of nature to calculations of economic development, right? And so in where I grew up in Texas, a piece of improved land was one where they wiped out all the trees and they gave you a flat piece of dirt.
Of course.
And so the calculations of it can be, I guess, sinister in a way. And I agree with you that treating a tree as a pile of cash is not the way to go. But at the same time, it's a way to value that nature in a way that it wouldn't otherwise be. And I guess that's where I would be coming from. I think that's the way that ecosystem services comes across in my mind. But I do appreciate the difference.
No, I think that's totally fair. I mean this seriously. I think if you want to have an effect on the world of policy, or you want to have a real effect on some real space, then like, maybe I shouldn't say this, but like my book is not going to help you, right? And I mean that genuinely. Like I kind of give myself permission to kind of play the critic in the book, right? And I give myself permission to like not come up with any positive solutions. And actually, when I give talks on this, and I hope you won't ask me this, Jeff, but invariably people ask, so so what would be good? Like, what would a good city look like? And I give myself permission to not do that. Partly because I'm not qualified to do that. I don't have any expertise in those kind of things. But partly because, I guess I have some faith, Jeff, that there are people like you, like smart people doing this work well. So like the fact that I give myself permission not to do this doesn't mean that I don't think it's valuable, and doesn't mean that like in a kind of a policy space, I would totally get why you would do that. You definitely wouldn't rock up and like give, an historical count of the kind of rational management of the city since the 19th century, right? That's not helpful to anyone trying to protect space in Texas or California or whatever it is. That's completely useless. I get that.
But I do appreciate I just, I don't want you to feel like I'm arguing with you about this, because I'm not.
No, please argue with
me. But I felt reading the book, it was interesting because it basically was a critical look at my urban planning history or my urban planning education, right? I actually I should disclose this, I have a picture up here on the wall that was drawn for me of Raymond Unwin. We did an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, right? The 1909 version of the book.
Yeah.
But you have questions about the folks from that time period, and also generally like new urbanism and Prince Charles's Poundbury and Leon Creer and those folks who a lot of people that I, do associate with and really love what they're about and what they think of. And so I find it really fascinating that you come from it from that different angle. And I was really appreciative of that because it made me question some of the things that I had grown up with in planning.
Can I ask you a question, Jeff?
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the people like about Poundbury?
As the person in the book said, I don't think it's Poundbury itself. I think it's the process, right? I think it's the process of putting it together. The new urbanists generally, I think it's the general ideas that they like, and implementing them is much harder than actually producing them, right? I guess I should say implementing them is much harder than not. I
totally
mean.
Like, so what I can be sympathetic to in Poundbury is, so in the book I interview one of the architects in Poundbury, and he says something like, listen, think of this as an experimental space, right? Think of it as like just one attempt to do this one thing that's a little bit weird and a little bit different. And that, if we hadn't done this would just be like any bog standard British housing estate, right? With kind of rows and rows of these extremely dull, packed together red brick small houses with like bad light, no places to play, cars parked everywhere, right? So that was the alternative. So maybe this little experimental attempt to do something odd, different, read it in those terms, it's kind of much more defensible. I can see that. And also, as you say, it's almost as a kind of a test bed for different kinds of things. So like one of the things they're proud of is how they put all the services behind the houses, right? So you don't have to dig up the streets for the services. Again, I'm sympathetic. There's all these kind of quite subtle things that you don't really see. Like they took the opportunity of a space governed by a certain kind of vision of how planning should work, just to say somewhat top down, like took that as an opportunity to work experimentally, because you couldn't do this in other spaces where you'd have to consult with local people, you'd have to, all kinds of other kind of considerations that come into play. But if, like it's a space that's literally owned by a king, you can like do some things that you can't otherwise do.
Speaking of kings, I feel like also a lot of the discussion in the book was about folks who had ultimate power to design places, and they end up being eugenicists or kind of overly, it goes back to that control thing again, I feel like. This idea of not creating places for people to live, but creating humans to forward the the empire or things like that. I felt that was very interesting, and in the case of Port Sunlight seemed very true.
Yeah. It's quite explicit in Port Sunlight. I mean, like, I do think I should disclose that, and I say this in the book, that the research for this book was funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which of course comes from a bequest from William Lever, the founder and potentate of Port Sunlight. But like Lever's vision of the capacity of a town to improve racial stock, in his terms, is really quite explicit. His sense of the place of urban planning in imperialism is quite explicit, right? Like with people like Ebenezer Howard, you're doing a bit of like reading into like the kind of eugenic discourse at the time and how the particular kind of words might bubble up that are problematic. But with Lever, you don't have to read it in, like it's on the surface. And so like, there's just something really striking to me about this. Like, I don't know if you've been to Port Sunlight, but Port Sunlight is like very cutesy. It's like small, these little kind of like gabley thatched terraces. It's very small. It's kind of, it all looks inward. It's quite beautiful. But the kind of juxtaposition of that kind of cutesy little like hobbit town, basically, and actually the explicitly imperialist and racist vision that animates it, I think, is what makes that such a potent space to me.
It's just really interesting from the standpoint of how it came about, right? And a lot of the discussion in the book about design too that leads towards fascism in a certain way, I found really interesting too, and makes me think about who has control over design. Right now, we're in California. There's a bunch of, tech moguls. You might have heard of a couple of them. You might not have, like Steve Jobs' wife and a bunch of other folks who basically put down $1 billion to buy up a bunch of land so they could build a new city.
Yeah. So this is a story in Ireland because the brothers who own Stripe are investors in this. So this became a quirky story in Ireland. But so I mean, but that's deeply sinister, right?
It feels that way, yeah. It feels that way. It feels like they didn't want to play under the existing rules, so they wanted to create a place where they could have their own rules.
Right. I think that's quite right. I do think one should think about, so it's unfortunate actually, because since I sent off the manuscript of the book, a bunch of kind of these odd tech utopian visions have sprang up. So one is this, I think certainly the holding company is called California Forever, is that right? That's the space.
That's the kind of the holding name for
right,
it.
Right, yeah. And the other, of course, that I would really wish was in the book is NEOM, or the line.
Saudi Arabia.
The Saudi Arabia kind of high-tech nature utopia. I actually went to Venice during the summer to see, so the line had an exhibition kind of at the fringes of the Venice Architecture Biennale, which was on this summer. So they rented a space in the center of Venice and had this kind of unsettling show about, not like about NEOM and about the line in particular, but really a show about a certain kind of, if you sat down and imagine what is an autocrat's idea of what the urban future looks like, this would be the show. It's just this kind of very smooth, high-tech, soothing music, no people. It's all about kind of work and live to work and the kind of highly managed spaces you can go in after work. And I do think we need to think these kind of spaces, one, together. So I think we should, if I can say, draw a line actually between the line and what's happening in California, what's happening in Tolosa, which is this other potential new kind of tech utopian space that's going to happen somewhere in the United States. I think we should think those simultaneously as kind of instances of the same movement, even though they're quite different efforts in many ways. And I think we should think them historically. We should trace them back quite specifically to not just to the Garden City movement, but to kind of 19th century company towns. And to, as you say, Jeff, as other attempts to think about how can we do urbanism without a certain set of rules, right? How can we do urbanism in a much more kind of disruptive way? That's absolutely what the tech tycoons of their day who were putting money into, the first Garden City company, that's exactly the kind of vision that animated them. And I do think if we can make sense of what happened there, what they were doing, what went wrong with those spaces, then we'll get a good grip on what's happening today. So I think the mistake we're making today is seeing these kind of spaces as kind of quirky or strange or kind of just a bit odd or funny, or, with the line that kind of constantly is people say, well, it's not going to happen. So they're not going to build, if you see the images of this thing, it looks so extraordinarily alien that it seems impossible this thing will ever exist. But to me, I don't think we should be reading these things as kind of quirky news stories. I think we should be reading them as troubling and sinister iterations of a long-standing worrisome urge.
So I'm not going to ask you what a good design would be, because I know that's not what the doctor ordered. But I do want to ask you, if folks aren't out there trying to figure out new ways of building cities or new ideas for building cities, are we stuck in the past?
Why not the present? What's wrong? Why is it the future or the past?
Well, I'm thinking of this in the way that, if we're not thinking about ways to build cities in a different way now, and maybe they don't need to be a different way. I'm leaving the question open to a certain extent.
Sure.
But at the end of the book, you're talking about kind of looking to the past, which the California Forever city is they wanted a city of the past or something like that. They actually said that out loud.
Right.
Or it's super futuristic, like the ideas that Schumacher comes up with.
Yeah, sure.
If we're not thinking of different ways to go about city building, where do we end up, I guess, is maybe my question.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, this is probably a boring sociologist kind of answer, but for me, design and building and physical space is not where we would start with any of that. In some sense, those, design feels to me so far downstream what a good city is or feels like or looks like, or the kind of practices that pertain in it, that it's uninteresting to me. I mean, something that kind of concerns me a lot about kind of contemporary urban discourse is the focus on aesthetics. And I think this is often a lot of my concern about the more kind of traditional minded stuff, for the kind of Poundbury, is that kind of sense that like there's a certain aesthetic vision. And once that aesthetic vision is achieved, then we have a good city. And so the social practices that make up the city, the people's kind of working relationships, like housing tenure, how good the transport is. I don't mean walkable in the sense of can you walk within 50 minutes, but like, is it just a nice experience to walk in the space? Will you bump into your paths? All that I think gets left behind in this kind of aesthetic discourse of like, what does the good future city look like? Or how should we design the good future city? And I mean, that really was like when I went to Venice, I mean, there's a lot of things that were upsetting about the line, but like, the complete absence of like human beings in its vision of the future good city is like deeply unsettling. And that really feels like it feels like the end point of a certain kind of aestheticized discourse in which like humans are almost secondary to, good urban design or like what a good city looks like. I mean, in the book, I kind of like I'm rude about a lot of places in the book, but like I'm rude about places like Copenhagen or like Paris. And that's kind of for the same reason, where I feel like people think they just see photos of like a nice harborside city with these quirky little houses and the painted nice colors, and you can see boats and it all looks kind of nice. And like, that's the vision of the good city. And it's just so vacuous to me. It's so empty, it's so distant from anything that I think we need to take seriously if we're going to take seriously the question of what does the good city look like, that I'm completely dismissive of it.
I think that's an interesting kind of discussion we're having here in the United States about housing, right? Because there's so much need for housing because we have been really bad about building it. That we're behind here in California, at least millions and millions of housing units, and that's why it's so expensive to live here. And then the discourse pops up about whether a building should be over 5 stories or not, right? And whether that's okay. And I feel like that's one of the things that I break with, new urbanism about, and a lot of the designers like Leon Creer or others, where, I like some of the ideas that they espouse, but then other ones like, we shouldn't have buildings that have elevators in them is something that just never made any sense to me. Or even Jan Gehl for lack of another person who is very influential and has lots of great ideas about, human cities and things like that. But at the same time, pushing out the ability to build tall buildings or house people in that way is frustrating to me, I feel like. And so I think that's part of the discourse too in the design field. I
think that's right. I mean, something that I feel is genuinely kind of a tragedy, certainly on this side of the world, is like, it feels like there's cultural agreement that that moment of massive post-war reconstruction, which was really in large part about building huge amounts of social housing in quite experimental physical spaces, right? In very high towers produced with quite, recent materials. Like, the kind of collective agreement we have now that was a failure, I think is actually kind of tragic. Like the idea that we can't do that anymore, or that was something that shouldn't have happened. And not that I'm like nostalgic for like kind of 1940s, 1950s urban vision, but like the fact that it's now just unthinkable to not just build housing, but to build social housing, right? To build social housing in which the vision is not that like just people who are poor or on welfare will live there, but actually everyone will live there, because the social housing will be so good that everyone will want to live there. And they will hire the best architects. I mean, you know this perfectly well. The London County Council hired huge amounts of architects right out of the Architectural Association. Like, the loss of that vision, I think, is genuinely a tragedy. I did a small bit of work that I never followed up on the archive of a woman called Margaret Willis. And Margaret Willis also worked for the London County Council. So the London County Council in the 1950s, this just seems unthinkable now, didn't just have its own architects, it had its own sociologists, right? So Margaret Willis was hired as a sociologist by London County Council to actually visit people who were being moved into these new spaces on the outskirts of London and just see what it was like. Like, what did they say about it? Like, did they like it? What did their kids think of it? And she produced these really beautiful reports that are not really available online, but they're in an archive in Edinburgh. This is a simplification, but like, people really liked it, right? There was a sense of adventure about moving into this very high building, that you could be up high and you could see your kids playing below. So that was nice. I think we've just told ourselves too much of a story. Like, we told ourselves like a 1980s story about kind of residualist social housing long after the state had given up on maintaining it, or, imagining that it could be something good, that we've really forgotten like what that was like in the 1950s and how transformational it was for lots of people.
That's an interesting part of the book too, is the idea that we come at cities from our views that were formed in the 80s and 90s when cities weren't resurgent, right? They were on the downswing, and I found that compelling as well. We often chat about cities and quote unquote fixing them with green space as if Taxi Driver was still the movie of the week, right?
Or Death Wish, yeah.
Or Death
I mean,
Wish.
it's true. I mean, like, even I have to remind myself that, like, in the 1980s, that London was considered a failing city. The population was falling. People were trying to get the hell out of it. And San Francisco is the same, but London is just now a city that you cannot live in unless you work for like Merrill Lynch, right? It's just like it's completely unthinkable that you might live in London. So, and it's the idea that it was so recent that like this was a place you would go if like life hadn't worked out that well, right? Or you had to be for some reason. I think is really forgotten about.
Is there something that you learned from writing the book that you didn't quite expect to come out the other side?
I mean, something that kind of took me by surprise, I'm going to choose my words a bit carefully here, is that I was surprised how unconvincing the evidence was for the relationship between nature contact or green materials and mental health. So I think we kind of take it, more or less for granted that like having more green stuff in urban space is good for mental health, right? I think we just kind of assume that. And a lot of that goes back to the kind of Roger Ulrich stuff and all the studies that follow that. And it's not that I don't think this is true, and it's not that I think those studies are bad, but I think there is a big gap between the extent and quality of the evidence for this relationship and like how prominent that discourse is in urban planning circles, if that makes sense. Like I had assumed that this is of course true, that we would radically improve mental health in urban space if we just, put like green walls everywhere and put trees down every street. And I'm no longer convinced that that's the case at all. I think it would have some kind of an effect, but like the effect would be so much smaller than making people's housing permanent or like resolving inequality or intervening in inequality. It's just what was a surprise to me was like how prominent the kind of urban greening to solve mental health discourse is in certain circles, and like how relatively small scale and still early stage and not super convincing the evidence currently is. If that makes sense. Yeah. Again, I stress it's not that I think those studies are bad, but it's just that like it's pretty small scale still, and nowhere near where you would expect it to be for like how big the interventions people are producing on behalf of it.
How much of it is it an income issue where, we know, for example, that areas of low income often don't get the investment in greenery that high income places do. So you'll see places in Los Angeles, for example, with the places with all the trees are basically the rich places, and the places without the trees are the places where folks don't have as much. And so there's kind of a skewing part of that as well. And I'm just wondering how that might be connected to the lack of knowledge or the lack of resources put into that field of study.
Yeah, I mean, I think in fairness, I think they're alive to this. I mean, you're quite right, and I think this too. That like, if you walk down a leafy street, you can be pretty sure in a street where like people are pretty high incomes, right? So like in some sense, I know this sounds glib, but like, of course they're happy, like they're doing fine in life, there was an amazing study done in Denmark where they got I talk about this a bit in the book, but they got historical satellite data that could show how much green space was near a person's house when they were age 12, I think. And then they could track that to the person's likelihood of a mental health diagnosis, I think at age 50. This because this is Denmark, they keep all kinds of like creepy data on people. So like researchers can do this. And they're able to show like in a really interesting and convincing way that basically the percent that like the number of meters of green space near your house as a child had a strong like dose response relationship with your likelihood of being diagnosed with mental illness in adulthood. That's super convincing, but like it is surely the case that people who are growing up surrounded by green space are people who are growing up with all kinds of advantages, right? Both tangible and intangible, not just things like income, but things like cultural capital, like parents' education, all those things that predict a relatively safe, comfortable, secure life, which of course will then predict or would then reduce the likelihood of becoming super stressed and developing a serious chronic mental health problem. Now, I'm not saying that those researchers aren't alive to these issues. I'm sure they control for all kinds of demographic factors. But like you, I just cannot be convinced, I think, that we can separate the cultural association of greenery with, good social, cultural, economic life and mental health.
One of the interesting things I saw in there too in the book was thinking about how when people go to nature to unwind, they're purposefully doing so. And there's an interesting connection between that, I feel like. And I mean, I love green spaces and going to the forest, and I used to run track and cross country. So I was in the forest all the time, and I found it soothing and relaxing and everything else. But also I feel like sometimes if you're going to the forest or you're going to a green space, you're doing it purposefully. And it's not necessarily just by chance that your mood might improve by walking by a tree.
Exactly that. I mean, in the book, I talked to a really, really good British psychologist called Eleanor Radcliffe. And she says she says two things. She says, one, it's certainly true that like being surrounded by greenery and nature has a calming effect, but that's not because of anything inherent to nature, right? It's not the natureness of it that makes it soothing. It's the fact that it's like, cognitively not very demanding. It's usually kind of quiet. Like it has all those other kind of associations that are just ancillary to the fact that it is a green space. And we could easily conceive of an urban space that would have the same qualities and would surely have the same kind of calming effects. And the other thing she says is that when we go into a green space, when we go to a forest or a park, we're going to a space that we've been told since like early childhood is calming, is associated with kind of wealth and comfort and serenity, right? So like, of course, then we enter those spaces, then we experience those feelings. I experience them authentically. I'm not trying to say that like people are dupes or they're fooled. Like I'm sure the feelings are very real. But again, it's not because of any kind of like deep metaphysical quality of trees. It's because we've been socialized to think that being near trees will calm you down. And so you go near trees and yes, it calms you down. I mean, that's, self-evident, I think.
Yeah. Well, the book is The Living City, Why Cities Don't Need to Be Green to Be Great. Where can folks find a copy if they want to? Actually, I should say, folks should get a copy. Where can they get one?
Insane. Well, folks can pre-order. So the book comes out, I don't know exactly, mid-November. So folks can pre-order from their favorite online or local store, I would say. It's published by Basic Books and hopefully will be reasonably widely available from November.
Awesome. What's next for you? Are there any other books on tap or anything that we should be looking out for?
Well, so something I talk about a little bit in the book is the kind of politics of traditional urbanism, right? The fact that a certain kind of vision of the traditional city seems to skew rightwards, right? And then at the same time, something that has struck me recently is it's interesting how frequently now, I would say people, not just on the right, but people on the far right, how often they track their kind of vision of the future through a certain kind of urbanism, right? So this kind of online fetish for like classical urbanism, for kind of these little traditional spaces, which is often quite subtly associated with like deeply reactionary ideas, is I think kind of underexplored, right? I mean, I mentioned in the book, I mean, one of the kind of last things that Donald Trump did before he left office was to sign an executive order to say that all federal buildings had to follow traditional or classical styles. Like that's not coincidental, right? So I think I would really like to make sense of what it is about that relationship, because there's nothing inherent in traditional classical design that is right-wing, right? And lots of people, I need to stress, who are working in this sphere, absolutely not right-wing or, are not political or, that's not what animates them. But there is something happening between those two things. I think there is a kind of it's going to sound paranoid when I put it like this, but a kind of a global right-wing movement, which is laundering itself at least partly through a certain vision of the city. And I don't think we've well understood that. And I think it's probably worth understanding.
Oh, I look forward to reading what you come up with. Well, Des, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast. And you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.